So returning to the idea of the profit maximizing firm, having gone through the revenue side, we are now going to spend quite a bit of time on the cost side. And the way we're going to think about costs is we're going to start by learning a little bit about costs and the way costs relate to the production process. Then we're going to do further deep dive into it in two subsequent sections, one on short-run costs and one on long-run costs. So let us begin again just by remembering that my profit is the same thing as total revenue minus total cost. And that the focus right now is going to be on total cost. So in order to get a sense of costs, the cost side is really determined by the production process that a firm uses for its production. So a firm is going to be paying for inputs, and by paying for inputs, it manages to make products, and then it takes those products and sells them. And as a profit maximizing firm, it's going to try and choose the amount it produces, quantity it produces, and the technology by which it produces. So going back to our early discussion, what to produce, how much to produce, how to produce. So those decisions are being made by the firm. And so when a firm is deciding how to produce, I'm going to start by noting that in terms of technology, firms have an opportunity or option to think about producing in different ways, and it can produce using either a labor-intensive or a capital-intensive mode, right? There are also debates about whether certain kinds of modes of production, technologies are really, say, over-dependent on extractive resources. So things like that. So renewable, less renewable, more renewable. But the difference between labor-intensive and capital-intensive isn't actually about whether something is modern or not. What matters is that the choice of technique is really going to end up depending on which technology ends up being the most appropriate in terms of scale, in terms of ways of producing in relation to a specific market. I will give you an example. It turns out that the mechanisms in terms of machines, raw materials, motors that you could use to produce a car is actually not that different than what you would use, say, to produce a boat of about the same size. But cars are a lot less expensive, and they're produced using large factories. Right? Boats often tend to be produced in much smaller shops, not as capital intensive, with more skilled labor involved. And this has to do with the scale of production resulting in it not actually making profit maximizing sense, given that there isn't the same sheer scale of market. There aren't people buying boats at the same level there are people buying cars. So it doesn't make sense to have such a mass capital production for boats the way it does for cars. Designer clothing is actually produced very often handmade, skill, right? And it's not labor intensive purely because it's more traditional. It's labor intensive because it doesn't make sense, given the scale of that market, to do high sort of production the way, say, you can have garment industries with sweatshops, t-shirts, things like that. So scale is going to really depend in some sense on the nature of the market. And it isn't just going to be, are you modern, are you traditional, and so on. And so this is why we're going to have to spend some time when we look through the theory of the firm to figure out how this firm is making choices of production technology. because you can end up producing things at different scales and with different levels of production of capital intensity. Right? Second, remember that even if you are producing more capital intensive or less capital intensive, you are always going to have employing workers, right? And the way capital works is that you have a machine, and then that capital is going to end up being very often, not uniquely, but very often what it's going to do is it's going to generate what I'm going to call fixed costs for you. Right? So supposing I have a grill. I've got a sandwich shop and I've got a grill. The cost of the grill is pretty much a fixed cost. I'm not getting a second grill every time I get a new customer. I'm not like, so that's a fixed cost. And so that cost is going to be the same whether I'm producing 1, 2, 5, 20, 50, whatever. To that, I'm going to end up adding variable costs. And variable costs tend to be of two types. One is basically variable raw materials or inputs. So, if I produce 2 sandwiches, then I will use twice the bread. If I produce 4 sandwiches, I will use 4 times the bread, things like that, right? Plus labor. In most cases, the single most important variable cost that any firm faces is labor. Labor is the thing that often varies, that you produce more, you hire more, produce less, you lay people off, and so on. So when we think about how a firm is making these decisions, it's really thinking about fixed costs, variable costs, input costs, and how much it should produce based on those kinds of ideas.